This second review goes from 1783, at the end of the Revolutionary War, the Treaty of Paris, all the way through 1787, the Constitutional Convention, through 1789, ratification of the Constitution. I got into it a little bit in the last review, but I'm going to go into much greater detail about the Articles of Confederation. As we've talked about, this idea of a confederation is where the power really is with the states. The idea was that many people in the new country did not want to revert back to a strong central government as they felt had oppressed them with Britain. So they created essentially an association of independent sovereign states. Really, the power was with the states. And in this document, which set up the government, which was also the name of the government, the Confederation government, each state only had one vote regardless of their population. There was only one house or a unicameral Congress. They had no real strong president, although there was nominally a president, and they had no judicial branch. Now, this intentionally weak Congress could do a few things, one of which it could declare war, it could make treaties, and it could ask to borrow money from the states. But at the end of the day, it was incredibly weak because it couldn't actually demand troops from the states. It couldn't levy taxes, and it couldn't regulate trade. These are real problems for any country that wants to be taken seriously overall. And at the end of the day, the real challenges came from the fact that they couldn't control sort of too much power with the people. And the best example of this will be seen in Shays' Rebellion. Now, Shays' Rebellion, like previous rebellions that we have seen, particularly Bacon's Rebellion, is a poor farmer rebellion, and it's sort of in western Massachusetts where people who'd fought in the war felt like they weren't getting paid quick enough. They were being taxed, their crop prices were low, and so in an effort to sort of stick it to the man, they said, we're going to actually try to capture the courthouses so that they can't actually continue to take our property from us when we don't have enough money to pay. Now, the idea that there was sort of an armed insurrection out west of Boston was very troubling to many of the wealthier people of Boston, many of whom had actually been part of the original revolution in the 1770s. What they had to do was they had to actually hire soldiers to go out and put down this rebellion because the federal government was too weak to actually do it itself. Now, what this showed, much like when you saw Bacon's Rebellion about 100 years earlier, it was a turning point moving from the indentured servitude to slavery. This was a turning point saying, you know what, this Articles of Confederation, this try at an intentionally weak government really won't work. We need to try to actually create a stronger central government to really protect our interests. Yet before we go to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, it is important to recognize that there was one major strength, if you can call it that, of the Articles of Confederation, and that was the organization of the land that was known as the Northwest Territory. Of course, I would like it to be renamed North Mideast Territory, but we'll stick with the old historic name, Northwest Territory, and what's known as the Northwest Ordinance. Now, there's two bits together. There's the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. We'll just refer to it all as the Northwest Ordinance. Now, what was noteworthy about these actions taken in the North Midwest that we now know is that first and foremost, it was a way to divide up the area. And so land would be surveyed and divided into these little sort of 6 square mile towns, and then each township had 36 sections, each of which was a square mile, and one of those 36 sections would be sold to support public education. So that's one of the major achievements, was the focus on public education. In addition, there was no slavery allowed in the Northwest Territory. There was religious freedom that was promised. And in addition, it was a way to show how you could take a territory that could move into a state. So once you basically had 5,000 adults, a district became a territory. And then once you had 60,000 adults, a territory could write a constitution and apply for statehood, which actually was a precedent set for sort of how to organize new lands. So when you think of the Northwest Ordinance, you think of emphasis on public education, anti-slavery, religious freedom, and how to organize area and later sort of officially bring it into the United States. Now we return to this question of what to do with this Articles of Confederation, which showed itself to be too weak overall. Now, there was no actual explicit effort to write a new constitution. Instead, people got together in Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. It was only supposed to be an update, revision, not scrapping it and coming up with something entirely new. Now, much like we'd seen previously, not all of the states attended. Rhode Island was opposed to any of this idea, so they didn't show up. And at this particular convention, there are a number of different sides. So you have your big states versus your small states. And the big states put forward a plan called the Virginia Plan, which would give more power ultimately to the big states in terms of representation. So the more people that you had, the more representatives you would have. The small states obviously objected to this. They didn't like the idea that they would be totally dominated by the big states. So they said, you know what? We'd like to propose a system where it's actually based on everybody gets the same amount, much as that had been under the Articles of Confederation. So in what's known as the Great Compromise, which took the Virginia Plan, the large states plan, and the New Jersey Plan, the small state plan, and compromised, they came up with what was known as a bicameral legislature, two houses. One is the House, one is the Senate. The House would be based on population. The Senate, every state would get 2 senators that would be in the Senate. Now, important parts that you need to know about that is the House members would serve for 2 years, the senators would serve for 6 years. So after they settled sort of this question of how are we going to be represented, they had to have a compromise between the northern and southern states. Obviously, the southern states wanted to benefit from the population that they had in terms of slaves, which meant that the more people that were counted in the southern states, the more power they would have in the House, which is based on population. The North didn't like this. The South also didn't want to have to pay any taxes on their slaves, whereas the North wanted to punish them that way and have them pay for their taxes. So the South wanted to have slaves count as 1 when it came to population for political representation, as 0, and when it came to taxation, the North wanted the inverse. So of course, they split it right down the middle and got 3/5, which meant that African Americans would be counted as 3/5 of white people when it came to political representation and taxation. Now, also decided at the Constitutional Convention were 3 important clauses, one of which was known as the Interstate Commerce Clause, which gave the federal government the power to regulate interstate, that means trade between states. Now, this had been a problem under the Articles of Confederation when they didn't have this power, and states basically waged economic warfare against each other. In addition, there is the Supremacy Clause, which means when a state law and a federal law are in conflict with each other, the state law reigns supreme. Last but not least is something known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, aka the Elastic Clause, aka the Implied Powers Clause, which essentially says that the federal government has a number of explicit or enumerated powers. One of those powers is to be able to do whatever is, quote, necessary and proper to actually put into effect those explicit powers. Now, again, it's a way to really allow the federal government to do what is unwritten so that it can actually execute what is written. Now, together, the Commerce Clause, the Supremacy Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause all gave the federal government far more power overall than you would have originally seen under the idea of federalism. Now, federalism is that idea that we saw with the Venn diagram where state and federal governments share power. So, of course, on the federal side, the Washington, D.C. side, you saw WMD-TTT, war powers, money powers, defense powers, abilities to make treaties, regulate trade, and execute tariffs. Now, down the middle, the shared powers, you saw the alert with the little a. So you saw punishing lawbreakers, protecting the environment, protecting people's rights, and taxes. And on the right-hand side of that Venn diagram, if you recall the state powers, you had EDM, like a goat at an EDM show, where you have elections, education, driver's license, and marriage. Now, I regret that I failed to inform you earlier when it was talking about what was decided in terms of the structure of the government, that as part of the Great Compromise, it was not only decided that there would be a House decided by representation population and Senate, which would be 2 from each state, but that there'd be 3 branches. Now, the House and the Senate make up the legislative branch, the branch that makes the laws. The executive branch is the president, executes the laws, and the judicial branch is essentially going to be the Supreme Court that interprets the laws. We'll find out much more about the Supreme Court later on when they get more powers in 1803 with something called judicial review. The main checks and balances that you need to understand between the branches, at least at the beginning, was that no laws would actually go into effect without the president's signature. So the president had the ability to check Congress, yet at the same time, Congress could override a presidential veto if they got enough support. At the same time, the Congress could actually impeach a president. That means to accuse them, and then there's a process for removing the president. We have never actually had a president removed from office. So you had this new Constitution. Not supposed to have it, we're supposed to just revise the Articles of Confederation, but there was this new Constitution. So the question became, how are we going to actually get the people to agree to this? So the idea was they were going to send it out to all of the 13 states. And in each of these states, there'd be special conventions made up of people who would actually vote on this. It would not go to state congresses, it would go to these special state conventions. And you would have to get 9 out of 13 to ratify this particular new set of rules, the Constitution, before it would go into effect. And there were 2 sides. They're factions. They're not political parties. They're groups organized for the purpose of a specific action. In this case, it was either ratifying the Constitution, the Federalists, or not ratifying it, the Anti-Federalists. And the Federalists came from this idea of the people that actually wrote the Constitution. They emphasized that a strong central government was needed to maintain order, that there was too much sort of mobocracy or potential of that, as we saw in Shays' Rebellion. They pointed to all the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, with its inability to regulate trade, to its inability to actually levy taxes, to its inability to really have troops for war. Some of the great minds were there supporting it. People like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. They had their support in the cities, and they were really well organized overall. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, complained, much like the revolutionaries had, against Britain, that basically a strong national government would lead to a kind of tyranny, exactly the kind that they fought against back in the Revolution. They said, look, if you have a strong central government, that government's going to abuse states' rights and individual liberties. And look, it's just a bunch of elite, educated, wealthy folks. We're just poor farmers who distrust any sort of central authority. So you really had sort of the haves, in some cases, versus the have-nots. The Anti-Federalists were particularly concerned with the absence of a Bill of Rights. They said, if there are not explicit protections offered by the federal government, we think that we are going to be abused. But since the ratification process was only a yes or no, not a yes but, they basically had to go on faith that if they said yes to the Constitution, that they could get this Bill of Rights added during the first Congress. Now, there was a specific effort in New York being a large and influential state, in terms of getting New York to ratify. There was strong anti-federalist support against the Constitution. Now, famously, people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay wrote what were known as the Federalist Papers. They were specifically for New York, not for the rest of the states. And the main idea of the Federalist Number 10, which is a specific paper written by Madison, was whereas there was an argument that prevailed that said that a republic, which is really power to the people, could only survive in a small nation, he said, no, no, no. A republic would actually be best in a large nation where all these small groups would emerge and they would really check each other. So the fact that there'd be small groups that could sort of check each other's power would make it so that they could never actually be abused. Really turned the idea of what a republic could be on its head, and ultimately New York did ratify the Constitution. Now, the Constitution was ratified ultimately by 11 out of the 13 states, and during that first Congress, as the Anti-Federalists had wanted, and as the Federalists promised would happen, there were 10 amendments that were immediately added to the Constitution. They had to go through a process, but they were ultimately added, and they're known as the Bill of Rights. From the First Amendment for freedom of religion, assembly, press, petition, and speech, to the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, and the Third Amendment, protection against having to quarter soldiers, and the Fourth Amendment, protection from unreasonable search and seizures. Fifth Amendment, the right to remain silent. Sixth and Seventh Amendment have to do with the right to an attorney and a speedy and public trial. The Eighth Amendment protected citizens from cruel and unusual punishment. 9 is sort of complicated, but 10 is this very important amendment, particularly for states' rights, that says if a power is not explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution, it is, quote, reserved for the states. So the 10th Amendment became known as the Reserved Powers Amendment, which became very important in Jefferson's fight with Hamilton over this battle between central government authority and states' rights.